939, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 1920s and how this decade affected us as Americans.
So Adam, tell me about the Red Scare.
Well, the Red Scare was a sudden eruption of anti-communist beliefs in the U.S. In panic, people began to diversify in their political beliefs. These people began to be called Reds. They became victims of public violence. This agitation was mainly directed at immigrants. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was the event that began the Red Scare. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks found the Communist International to push for communist parties worldwide. Many Americans feared that this Communist Labor Party would take over the United States. The fear of this communist group in the U.S. was increased from economic distress. The U.S. were also alarmed by bomb attacks, which they blamed on the Communist Party. The Red Scare began to subside after the Palmer raids of January 2nd, 1920, from the orders of Attorney General Palmer, in which about 10,000 were arrested and nearly 600 foreigners were deported.
Adam, why don't you tell us about the anti-immigration in the 1920s?
Well, Matt, I will. Anti-immigration. Between the years of 1880 and 1920, more than 25 million immigrants had moved into the U.S. The newer immigrants were mostly males coming to our country looking for jobs and new opportunities. Somewhere in between 50% and 80% had moved back to their home country. These immigrants would temporarily stay in America until they had enough money to travel home. They would only go back if they returned wealthier than when they left. In the year 1924, a new law was passed that limited the amount of immigrants moving in.
So Adam, you want to tell us about the Scopes trial?
Yeah. Well, the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial, which went against the American religion and tradition, public schools teacher John T. Scopes went against these values by teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which contradicted the Bible's theory of the origins of man. Thousands of people showed up to the courtroom every day. It was also the first trial to be broadcasted live on the radio. Although Scopes was convicted and the law remained untouched, many Americans sided with Scopes and evolution continued being taught in schools. Also, praying and other religious activities were banned in public schools.
Adam, why don't you tell us about the medical advances in the 1920s?
Well, Matt, there were many medical advances during the 1920s. Before guns were introduced, swords and spears were used. These weapons caused tissue damage, but the wounded soldier would often survive. The flying ambulance was created by Dominic Jean Larry, which improved the rapid evacuation of wounded soldiers from the battlefield and took them to hospitals. Surgery began using a process called debridement, which is removing all of the dead tissue and foreign objects in the body.
Thank you, Adam.
So Adam, why don't you tell us about women's suffrage in the 1920s?
Well, David, women's suffrage. Before the 19th century in America, women had very low social status. The husband had total control over the family. Woman could not own property, sign contract, or gain custody of her child. Women's suffrage was a movement which led to a Constitution amendment in 1920. This Constitution gave human rights to women in the United States. In 1866, Susan B. Anthony started the American Equal Rights Association to work for universal suffrage. Regardless of race or gender, this group split up after the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed in 1868 and 1870. These amendments gave citizenship and the right to vote to African American males, making no mention of women.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation on the 1920s, and I hope you learned just the importance of this decade in our nation. Until next time, good night from AP39.